Shadow of the badge. The night air in Greenhaven City carried a hint of rain, the moisture clinging to the pavement like sweat on the skin of the city itself. Storefront gates were drawn down, flickering neon signs half-heartedly announcing late-night diners and liquor stores. In the distance, the wail of a siren cut through the hum of tires skimming over wet roads. It was a typical night in this corner of the city. Too quiet, too loud, all at once. Angela Hargrave walked briskly along the uneven sidewalk, her heels clicking sharply with every step. The tailored gray suit clung to her like armor, a symbol of the authority she carried even when she wasn't standing at a podium or commanding attention in a courtroom. Her thick, dark hair was neatly twisted into a bun at the nape of her neck, and her leather briefcase swung lightly by her side, the handle worn from years of use. The week had been long, and her mind was already layering tomorrow's tasks on top of today's victories. The corner store, the only beacon of light on the otherwise dim street, reflected across puddles and fractured reds and greens. Angela had parked several blocks away, choosing to walk the last stretch to clear her head. It was something she did often, a grounding ritual, a reminder that no matter how high she climbed, these streets had shaped her. A patrol car sat at the curb ahead, its engine humming low. Inside, Officer Ryan Callum slouched in the driver's seat, his fingers drumming idly on the steering wheel. His partner, Officer Keith Hernandez, scrolled mindlessly through his phone, the blue glow illuminating the tired lines of his face. "You see her," Callum muttered, nudging Hernandez with his elbow. His eyes locked on Angela as she neared the crosswalk, the briefcase catching his attention first, then the suit, then the deliberate way she carried herself. Confident, self-assured. Too confident for this part of the city, he thought. "She's just walking," Hernandez replied without looking up. "Nah," Callum said, sitting up straighter. "Look at her, dressed like that, walking through this neighborhood at this hour. Something's off." Hernandez sighed, already sensing where this was going. "Let it go, man." But Callum was already opening the door. The slam of his boot against the pavement startled Angela out of her thoughts. She glanced up, her posture straightening, her lawyer instincts clicking into place the moment she saw the patrol car's insignia. Her heels came to a halt just before the crosswalk. "Evening, Mom." Callum's voice was light, almost playful, though his stance was anything but casual. One hand rested near his belt, fingers a hair's breadth from his holstered weapon. "Out for a stroll." Angela's face gave nothing away, though the sharpness in her gaze didn't miss the way his eyes swept from her heels to her face and back again. "Just heading to my car," she replied evenly. "Kind of late to be out, don't you think?" Callum's smile didn't touch his eyes. Angela's hand tightened around the briefcase handle. "Am I breaking any laws, officer?" "Not yet." The words came too quickly, too rehearsed. "Mind if I see some ID?" Angela's jaw clenched. "What's your reasonable suspicion?" Callum took a half-step closer, the damp air amplifying the tension between them. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." She didn't. They both knew it. "I'm not required to show you ID unless you have reasonable suspicion that I'm committing a crime," Angela said, her voice smooth but firm. Callum's smile faded. This wasn't the first time someone had quoted their rights to him, but it was the first time in months someone had done it without flinching. "You're acting suspicious," Callum said, his voice sharper now. "Where you coming from?" Angela's patience, honed through years of cutting through courtroom noise, barely wavered. "That's not relevant." "Let me see that bag," Callum said. "No." The word hung in the air, heavier than the night itself. Hernandez finally glanced up from his phone, recognizing the edge in Callum's voice. "Callum, man, leave it." But Callum's grip was already closing around Angela's wrist. The metal snap of the cuffs was a sound Angela knew too well, a sound she had fought to keep off the wrists of countless innocent clients. The cold bite of steel against her skin sent a flash of fury through her veins, but her face remained calm, her spine straight. "This is an unlawful arrest," Angela said, her voice clear even as Callum pulled her hands behind her back. "You have no cause." Callum didn't answer. He shoved her briefcase to the ground, scattering papers across the wet pavement, contracts, case files, notes from an upcoming deposition. The words bowled into the water, ink feathering into the cracks of the sidewalk. "Ma'am, you're resisting," Callum muttered, even though she wasn't. "Someone record this," Angela called out, spotting a man on the corner with his phone raised. "Please." The man nodded, his camera trained on the scene, capturing every second. As Callum maneuvered her toward the patrol car, Angela's mind raced, not with panic, but with precision. The faces of the officers, the exact language they used, the lack of probable cause. Each detail was a brick, and she was already building her case, even before the cell door would close behind her. "You think you're somebody special," Callum muttered as he pushed her into the back seat, her knees knocking against the doorframe. "You're just another mouthy broad who thinks she's smarter than the law." Angela didn't respond. She sat back, the plastic seat biting into her legs, her cuffs too tight. Her silence was her weapon. She would speak, but not here. Not in this patrol car where words could be twisted. She would speak in court, where every syllable would be a scalpel. The station was a fluorescent nightmare, all flickering lights and worn linoleum, the sour smell of coffee and sweat clinging to the air. Callum marched her to the booking desk like a prize he couldn't wait to display. "Found her wandering around like she owns the place," Callum said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Gave me attitude, wouldn't show ID, probably casing stores or something." Angela stood tall, shoulders squared, gaze level. "I'm an attorney," she said for the third time that night. "This is an illegal detainment." Callum grinned. "Yeah. Well, lawyers sit in holding cells too." The snap of the fingerprint scanner capturing her prints felt almost theatrical, the system cataloging her, as if it could strip her of the power she held. They patted her down, rifled through her pockets, all while she stood still, her composure refusing to crack. But her mind was already racing ahead, every protocol violation, every unnecessary escalation. All of it was ammunition. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to dismantle every lie they told, and every bias they wore like second skin. The cell door clanged shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the quiet hallway. Angela sat on the metal bench, her hands resting on her lap, her back straight. There was no fear in her. There was only a steady, growing resolve. The walls around her might be cold concrete, but in her mind, she was already in a courtroom, her voice cutting through the silence, each word a hammer against the foundation of everything officers like Callum stood on. What Callum didn't know, couldn't know, was that the woman he had arrested was Angela Hargrave, the Chief Prosecutor for the state of Greenhaven. By the time the sun rose, he would know. And so would everyone else. The unraveling begins. The hard plastic bench in the cell was unforgiving, pressing into Angela's thighs through the thin fabric of her slacks. The air was thick with disinfectant masking the underlying staleness of sweat, fear, and old regret. The light above her flickered, buzzing faintly like an insect caught between the present and the past. The sounds of the station. Distant phones ringing, muffled radio chatter, the squeak of rubber soles against tile were her only companions. Angela Hargrave had spent countless hours on this side of the system, but never on this side of the bars. Her mind, sharp and conditioned by years in courtrooms, was already dissecting every second of the interaction that led her here. Every unlawful touch, every taunt, every moment Officer Callum's hand hovered just a little too close to his weapon. All of it cataloged and filed in the ever-expanding case she was building in her mind. Injustice wasn't new to her. Angela had prosecuted police brutality cases, exposed corruption in city council offices, and sat across tables from hardened criminals whose fear of her exceeded their fear of prison. But this, being shackled by the very system she had dedicated her life to holding accountable, this was personal. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Callum's voice, too loud, as if volume could erase uncertainty. Found her wandering around like she owned the damn block, Callum boasted, his bravado filling the station's common area. Mouthy too. Wouldn't show ID. Couldn't let her just walk off. His audience, a loose cluster of younger officers and a couple of veterans too exhausted to care, barely looked up from their screens. One rookie chuckled nervously, sensing the discomfort, while another officer, Sergeant Janice Powers, leaned against the wall, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Did you run her ID yet?" Powers asked, her voice a touch too casual. "Didn't need to," Callum replied, puffing out his chest. "She's one of those know-my-rights types. You know how they are." The silence that followed made Callum glance up, his swagger slipping for just a moment. "Still," Powers said, her tone still light, but her gaze hard. "You should probably process her, right? Do things by the book." Yeah, Callum waved her off, but the suggestion lodged in his mind like a splinter. Angela, seated on her bench, tilted her head back against the concrete wall, closing her eyes for just a second. She could feel it happening already, the cracks forming. One officer with a nagging sense of professionalism, another with a shred of curiosity. This was how the unraveling began. She didn't need to fight the system directly. It would dismantle itself if you gave it enough rope. The metallic rattle of keys at the far end of the hall made Angela open her eyes again. Officer Keith Hernandez, Callum's partner, approached the cell, his expression unreadable. He wasn't new to the job, but there was something about tonight. The paperwork, the discomfort, that sat wrong with him. "Water?" Hernandez asked, his voice soft. "I'm fine," Angela replied, her voice smooth and calm, though her throat was dry. Hernandez stood there a second longer, fidgeting with his caring. "What's your name?" he finally asked. Angela tilted her head slightly, assessing him. His posture lacked the aggressive tension Callum carried, but there was still caution there, a man caught between duty and doubt. "Angela Hargrave," she said, her voice carrying the quiet weight of certainty. Hernandez's brow furrowed faintly. That name, it sparked something, though he couldn't place it. "I'll be back," he said, turning on his heel. Angela smiled faintly to herself. He'll check. And when he does, the real fun begins. The whispered name. The break room was quiet save for the hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the aging coffee maker. Hernandez stood by the computer terminal, scrolling through the internal database, fingers moving slower than usual. He typed in Angela Hargrave, expecting nothing more than a clean record, maybe an old parking ticket. The screen populated quickly, far too quickly, and the profile photo staring back at him was a professional headshot, familiar from the press conferences and legal updates officers were often briefed on, but rarely paid attention to. Angela Hargrave, Chief Prosecutor, State of Greenhaven. Hernandez blinked once, then twice. The air felt heavier. The cursor blinked expectantly, waiting for further input, but Hernandez could only stare at the words. His stomach turned, bile creeping up his throat. "Shit," he whispered. He clicked through, scrolling past high-profile cases she had prosecuted. Public corruption, police misconduct, organized crime. Her reputation was ironclad. Even in police circles, her name was spoken with a mix of grudging respect and thinly veiled resentment. Callum had arrested her. Hernandez felt the cold sweat prickle at the back of his neck. He closed the screen quickly and glanced around, as though the walls themselves might accuse him of guilt by association. The captain's door. Captain Howard Brennard was no stranger to 3M headaches, but the sight of Hernandez knocking softly at his office door brought a different kind of tension. Brenner was old school, the type who believed problems should die before they reached his desk. But Hernandez's face told him this was a corpse too big to bury. "What is it?" Brenner grunted, already annoyed. Hernandez stepped inside, shutting the door carefully. "We've got a problem." Brenner leaned back, hands clasped over his stomach. What kind? The woman Callum brought in. Hernandez started, his throat dry. It's Angela Hargrave. The name hung in the air like a live wire. Brenner's hands slowly unclasped, his brow knitting together. The Angela Hargrave. Hernandez nodded. Jesus Christ. Brenner's chair squeaked as he sat up straighter. Does Callum know? No, Hernandez admitted. I just checked. Brenner scrubbed a hand over his face, muttering a string of curses under his breath. Okay, we have two options. We let her out quietly, apologize, and pray she doesn't sue our asses into oblivion. She's a prosecutor, Hernandez added quietly. She doesn't let things go. Option 2. Brenner continued, ignoring the comment. We stick to protocol. Process her by the book. Call the DA, and let the chips fall. Hernandez swallowed. Sir, with all due respect, Callum didn't have cause. If this gets out. Oh, it's getting out, Brenner said sharply. It's just a question of whether it's a scandal or a lawsuit. The calm before the storm. In the cell, Angela sat with her back straight, the epitome of composure. She wasn't worried, not for herself. The law was on her side, not because of her title, but because the facts were indisputable. She knew what they'd find once they ran her name. She knew the slow shift from arrogance to fear that would spread through the station like smoke. This wasn't her first battle with the system, but it was the first time the system had made the mistake of putting her inside the walls instead of across the table. When the door at the end of the hall creaked open again, Angela's eyes flicked toward it. The captain himself was approaching now, Hernandez trailing behind. The captain's face was pale, a forced smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ms. Hargrave, Brenner said, his voice stiff with false politeness. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Angela stood, her eyes meeting his with unflinching calm. Misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice a soft scalpel. That's what we're calling this. The captain shifted uneasily. I'd like to have a word, if you don't mind. Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking on the concrete. Oh, she said with a smile colder than the bars behind her. I mind. Because the reckoning had begun. A system on trial. Angela Hargrave followed Captain Brenner down the long corridor of the precinct, the sound of her heels tapping out an even, deliberate rhythm. Each step was a reminder, to them, to herself, of exactly who she was and what she was made of. The steel in her spine had been forged long before this night, but tonight it would be put to the ultimate test. Brenner's office was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescent buzzing faintly. Papers were strewn across his desk, evidence of a man who was either overwhelmed or simply didn't care for order. Neither boded well. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Angela, Brenner, and Hernandez in a tense silence. Brenner gestured toward a metal chair across from his desk, the kind that always seemed slightly too cold or slightly too warm. Angela ignored the offer and remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her. Ms. Hargrave, Brenner started, his voice low, almost conciliatory. This whole situation is regrettable. Angela arched a brow. Regrettable. The word rolled off her tongue like poisoned sugar. That's the word you're choosing. Brenner's face flushed, but his jaw tightened. This was a misunderstanding. An unfortunate mix-up. Officer Callum was out of line, Angela said, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. He lacked reasonable suspicion. He violated my Fourth Amendment rights. He used unnecessary force. He humiliated me, and your station allowed it. Hernandez shifted his weight, glancing at the floor. The heat in the room was suffocating, not from temperature, but from the sheer force of Angela's presence. Ms. Hargrave, Brenner tried again. I understand you're upset. Angela's laugh was low and cold. Upset? Captain, I'm not upset. She leaned forward slightly, her hands pressing onto his desk. I'm focused. Brenner swallowed hard. Angela took her seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her composure chilling in its precision. "Let me be clear," she said, her tone even. "You arrested me without cause. You paraded me through your station like a trophy. You violated the law, the Constitution, and my basic human dignity." Her smile was razor sharp. "You don't get to wave that off as a misunderstanding." Brenner's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his desk. "What are you planning to do?" Angela leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "What I always do, Captain. Hold the powerful accountable." Panic behind the badge. Outside Brenner's office, the station was crackling with nervous energy. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Callum arrested the chief prosecutor. Officers whispered in corners. Text messages pinged between shifts, and even the night dispatcher was glued to her phone, reading articles about Angela Hargrave's previous prosecutions. Callum, for his part, was still oblivious. He sat on the edge of his desk, nursing a cup of coffee like a man who'd just won the lottery. "Toughest part of the job," he was saying to anyone who would listen, "is keeping these so-called civil rights lawyers in check. They know just enough to be dangerous, you know. Think they're above the law." Officer Janice Powers stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with an expression caught somewhere between disgust and pity. "You might want to check your facts," she said finally. Callum smirked. "What facts?" "Her name." Callum's brow furrowed, but Powers was already walking away, leaving him to stew in confusion. The realization. The station's public relations officer, Denise Langley, was jolted awake by her buzzing phone. It was 4:23 a.m. She squinted at the screen, her heart sinking at the flood of missed calls and frantic texts. 911. Urgent. Call Captain Brenner. She didn't bother changing out of her pajamas before calling him back. His voice was gravelly with exhaustion and fear. "We have a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that gets reporters at our door before sunrise." Within minutes, Langley was in her car, her mind racing through possible damage control strategies. Nothing good ever followed a call like this. Angela's preparation. Back in Brenner's office, Angela's phone, returned to her after an agonizing 2-hour delay, buzzed steadily with incoming messages. Her chief of staff, her lead investigator, and her communications director were already awake, mobilizing her team. Her face remained impassive as she scrolled, her fingers pausing only to type brief responses. Confirm Callum's prior complaint history. Contact Civil Rights Council. Full investigation demand. Prepare press statement. She knew how to fight this war. The front lines were just different this time. The fragile brotherhood. Callum's dawning realization hit at 5:07 a.m. when Sergeant Powers casually dropped a printed article onto his desk. The headline was damning. Angela Hargrave, state's top prosecutor, takes aim at police misconduct. The photo beneath it was unmistakable. The woman he'd cuffed, shoved, mocked, and paraded like a catch of the day was smiling at a press conference, her name emblazoned in bold under the caption, "Champion of Justice." The blood drained from Callum's face. This isn't. He couldn't even finish the sentence. "No," Powers said quietly, "it isn't." For the first time, Callum's cocky bravado evaporated, leaving only a shell of a man clinging to excuses he knew wouldn't hold up. The public awakens. By 6:00 a.m., Angela's team had mobilized a quiet storm. Local journalists who had long admired her work were tipped off, their curiosity sparked by the undisclosed arrest of a high-profile figure. The whispers spread online, morphing into rumors, then into breaking news segments. Chief Prosecutor Hargrave wrongfully arrested by Greenhaven PD. The headline flashed across morning television screens, triggering a cascade of calls from civil rights leaders, community activists, and even state officials. Angela, now seated in the station's small interview room, took a call from the governor's office herself. "We're behind you," the governor's chief counsel said. "If you want to push for a full state investigation, you have our blessing." Angela's smile was grim. "I don't need your blessing," she said softly. I need accountability. The reckoning approaches. By 7 a.m., reporters had gathered outside the precinct, cameras rolling as the sun rose over Greenhaven. The mayor, notified in the early hours, issued a vague statement about fully investigating the incident. Angela, now freshly changed into a suit brought to her by her assistant, stood at the window of Brenner's office, watching the growing crowd outside. The machine was in motion now. There was no stopping it. She turned to Brenner, who looked like a man drowning in his own uniform. "You have a choice, Captain," Angela said. "You can stand with the truth, or you can sink with your officers." Brenner's mouth opened, then closed. There was no good answer. Angela turned back to the window, her reflection superimposed over the press outside. This wasn't just about her. This was about every innocent black woman who had been cuffed without cause, every marginalized voice silenced by men with badges and unchecked power. This was the fight she'd been preparing for her entire life. Cracks in the foundation. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Angela Hargrave stepped out of the Greenhaven police precinct, her heels striking the pavement with the same unshakable confidence she had carried into every courtroom for the past 15 years. Except now, she wasn't walking into a courthouse as the state's chief prosecutor. She was walking into a battlefield. The press had gathered, their cameras and microphones pointed directly at her, waiting to capture her first public word since the news broke. The chief prosecutor of the state of Greenhaven, wrongfully detained by her own city's police department. She stood still for a moment, allowing the camera flashes to ignite, the murmurs of reporters to weave together into a low, anticipatory hum. Then she spoke. "What happened to me last night was not unique," she began, her voice smooth and clear, carrying over the chaotic din. "It was not an isolated incident. It is, instead, a symptom of a larger disease, a disease of profiling, abuse of authority, and a culture that protects officers who violate the very laws they swear to uphold." The reporters leaned in, pens scribbling furiously. "But I am not just a victim," she continued, her dark eyes sweeping across the crowd. "I am a witness, and I am a warrior. And I will not rest until this department, and every department like it, understands that no one is above the Constitution." She didn't take questions. There would be time for that later. She had bigger plans to set in motion. The internal storm. Inside the precinct, the mood had shifted from uncomfortable to outright combative. Officers who had once laughed at Callum's swagger now avoided his eyes. He stood near the locker room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. "She was nobody when I stopped her," he muttered to no one in particular, his voice hollow. "Just some woman walking late at night with an attitude." "You didn't check her ID," Sergeant Powers said from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. "That's the first thing you do." "The first? How the hell do you cuff someone without even checking?" Callum's jaw twitched. "I had a hunch." "Hunches aren't probable cause," Powers snapped. "And now the whole damn state's watching us, because your hunch put handcuffs on the state's chief prosecutor." The words landed like a slap, but Callum's stubbornness had kept him alive in this department. "She baited me," he said, grasping for anything. She was looking for a fight. Powers' expression was unreadable, but her silence was louder than any argument. Callum was sinking, and everyone in the building knew it. Angela's next move. Angela sat at her dining table, a thick folder spread out before her, steam curling from the untouched cup of coffee at her elbow. Her legal team had already assembled preliminary filings, a civil rights lawsuit, a formal demand for an independent investigation, and an official request for Officer Callum's suspension pending review. But Angela wasn't just interested in Callum. Callum was a symptom. The culture inside Greenhaven PD was the disease. She wanted the disease exposed. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was Terrell Banks, her lead investigator, a broad-shouldered man with a face worn from too many late nights and a permanent look of skepticism. "We've got a problem," Terrell said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Angela raised a brow. Just one. Terrell tossed a thick folder onto the table. We pulled Callum's personnel file. Angela flipped open the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. Excessive force complaints. Disciplinary hearings swept under the rug. A half-dozen incidents with vague resolutions. Greenhaven PD's Professional Standards Office is a joke, Terrell said grimly. They never punished him for anything. Every complaint. Resolved internally. Every witness. Deemed unreliable. Angela closed the folder slowly. They built him, she said quietly. They protected him until he believed he was untouchable. That's not all. Terrell hesitated, then slid a second, thinner folder toward her. We started pulling incident reports filed by other officers in his unit. Angela opened it, her brow furrowing as she scanned the pages. Reports filed, and later revised after conversations with superiors. Witness statements that vanished from case files. There was a clear pattern. A culture where silence was rewarded and speaking out was career suicide. This isn't just about Callum, Angela said. This entire department needs to be disinfected. The union pushed back. By the afternoon, the Greenhaven Police Union had released a terse statement defending Callum's actions, calling the arrest a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by political interests. It was standard playbook. Shift blame, minimize wrongdoing, and frame the officer as the real victim. Angela expected it. She'd seen the play before. But this time, the script had changed. Because she wasn't just a name on a complaint. She was a public figure, a legal expert, and a woman with direct access to the media and the governor's office. She would not be framed. Not this time. The mayor's dilemma. Greenhaven's Mayor Elaine Voss sat in her office, watching Angela's press statement replay for the 5th time. Each viewing made the knot in her stomach tighten. She had run on a platform of police reform, but her own office had repeatedly balked at pushing too hard against the union, and now it was too late to take the easy road. Elaine, her chief of staff, said cautiously, "You need to get ahead of this." The mayor's fingers drummed against her desk. "Set a meeting with Hargrave," she said finally. "I want to hear directly from her." "And Callum." "Let internal affairs handle him," Voss said. "But if they don't suspend him by the end of the day, I'll do it myself." Callum's isolation. In the locker room, Callum sat alone. His phone buzzed with texts from his union rep, promising support and legal representation. But the messages felt hollow. The backslaps and jokes from his fellow officers were gone. When he walked into the briefing room, conversations stopped. Some officers made excuses to leave. He had become radioactive. The sense of power he had once wielded, the unspoken confidence that the badge would shield him, was gone. The blue wall wasn't crumbling. It was collapsing on top of him. The civil rights machine awakens. Angela's legal team worked through the night. Drafts of the federal civil rights complaint were refined. Each line a surgical strike against not just Callum, but the policies that enabled him. The complaint didn't just name him. It named the Greenhaven Police Department, the chief, and the city itself, alleging a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing targeting minorities. By dawn, Angela's face was once again on the news, but this time, she wasn't just speaking for herself. "I stand not just for me," she said in a live interview. "I stand for every black woman, every citizen who has been stopped without cause, who has been silenced and humiliated. The time for excuses is over. The time for justice is now, the beginning of the end." The U.S. Attorney's Office called by noon, requesting a formal meeting to discuss potential federal intervention into the Greenhaven Police Department. Investigators from the Department of Justice were already reviewing the arrest footage. Civil rights groups announced a planned march through the heart of the city. The story was no longer just local. It was national. Angela Hargrave had spent her career prosecuting injustice. Now, for the first time, she was the face of it. And she intended to make sure the whole system felt the heat. When the system shakes, The hum of tension inside the Greenhaven police precinct was palpable, a living thing curling in the corners of the building. Every officer could feel it, the weight of the world outside pressing against the station walls like a tide that could no longer be held back. It wasn't just Angela Hargrave's arrest anymore. That was the match. Now, the whole damn structure was on fire. The union scramble. In a windowless conference room on the second floor, Detective Rudy Callahan, head of the Greenhaven Police Union, sat at a long table across from Officer Ryan Callum. Callahan had been in the game long enough to see disaster brewing from a mile away. But this was a hurricane. "You need to understand something," Callahan said, his voice low, calm. "The union will cover your legal fees, but we're not jumping on any grenades for you." Callum's jaw tightened, his palms sweating against the tabletop. "I was doing my job." "No," Callahan said bluntly. "You were showboating, and you didn't do your homework. You cuffed the chief prosecutor of the entire damn state without cause. That's not just a mistake, Callum. That's career suicide." Callum's hands curled into fists, but there was no fight left in them. "I didn't know who she was. That's the problem," Callahan shot back. "You didn't care. And now every civil rights lawyer from here to Washington is circling like sharks." Across the room, the union's lead attorney, Mark Leftridge, flipped through the preliminary lawsuit draft Angela's office had already leaked to the press. His face grew grimmer with every page. Systemic civil rights violations, patterns of racial profiling, suppression of internal complaints. Leftridge shook his head. "This isn't just about you, Callum. Hargrave's putting the entire department on trial." The weight of it finally landed in Callum's chest, crushing what was left of his defiance. "She's gonna destroy me," he whispered. "No," Callahan corrected. "She's gonna destroy all of us, unless we find a way to control the narrative." But they both knew it was already too late. Angela's war room. In Angela's downtown office, the conference room had been transformed into a command center. Half a dozen attorneys, investigators, and civil rights advocates were crammed around a table littered with documents, timelines, personnel files, and maps charting documented patterns of abusive stops in minority neighborhoods. A digital whiteboard flickered on the far wall, projecting a live feed of social media chatter. The public outcry was growing by the hour. Hashtags like #JusticeForAngela, #GreenhavenReckoning, and #ReformNow trended nationwide. Angela stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The prosecutor in her had shifted into a general at war. "We aren't just litigating a wrongful arrest," Angela said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "We are exposing the architecture of abuse that allowed Callum to feel invincible. Every internal report he filed and revised. Every complaint his supervisors buried. Every officer who saw and said nothing." Terrell Banks, her lead investigator, tapped a file thick enough to choke a shredder. "We pulled 5 years of internal discipline logs. It's a graveyard of covered tracks." Angela's chief strategist, Monique Sellers, pulled up a timeline of Greenhaven PD's disciplinary cases on her tablet, her brow furrowed. "We've got at least 8 officers with excessive force complaints who were quietly reassigned or given counseling. And Callum's name pops up in half of those cases." Angela exhaled slowly. "This isn't just about Callum. It's about a culture that fostered him." She tapped the table. "We aren't negotiating," she said. "We file the civil rights lawsuit against Callum, but we name the chief, the department, and the city itself as co-defendants. We make sure everyone understands. This isn't just one bad cop. This is the price of silence." The table went silent. No one doubted Angela's conviction, but this was a war bigger than any single case, and Angela had just drawn the battle lines. The fracture within the force. By midday, Greenhaven PD was a department divided. Younger officers, some already disillusioned by the old guard's culture, whispered uneasily in break rooms. A few, especially those who had witnessed Callum's aggression firsthand, started reaching out to reporters, offering anonymous accounts. Veteran officers, the ones who had spent years perfecting the art of plausible deniability, huddled in tighter circles. They knew this wasn't just about Callum. If Angela dug deep enough, and they knew she would, their secrets would spill too. Internal Affairs had already started pulling records, reviewing body cam footage, and tracking every complaint tied to Callum's name. A single officer could be sacrificed to save the department, but if Hargrave's team proved this was systemic, the department itself could fall under federal oversight. The thin blue line was tearing at the seams. The community awakens. By late afternoon, the streets outside the precinct were filled with protesters, their chants echoing through the downtown corridor. No justice, no peace. Angela stands. We stand. Accountability now. Civil rights leaders, pastors, and community organizers took turns at the microphone, turning Angela's arrest into a rallying cry. Some told their own stories. Stories of stops without cause, of arrests without explanation, of beatings and humiliation that never made the news. Angela wasn't just a prosecutor anymore. She was a symbol. And symbols, once born, were impossible to control. The mayor's panic call. By early evening, Mayor Elaine Voss stood in her office, phone pressed to her ear, as Angela's face flickered across her television screen. "Angela," Voss said, her voice carefully measured, "I need you to know the city is taking this seriously." Angela stood in her own office, looking out over the sea of protesters gathering below. "Are you?" she asked, her voice calm. "Because what I've seen so far is a lot of scrambling and not a lot of accountability." Voss took a breath, forcing patience. "I'm ready to meet. Let's talk through this before it spirals out of control." Angela's smile was razor sharp. "It's not spiraling, Elaine. It's unfolding exactly how it needs to." Voss's silence was answer enough. Callum's collapse. That night, Callum sat alone in his apartment, the TV muted as Angela's face filled the screen. She wasn't just talking about him anymore. She was talking about a culture of impunity, about how every wrongful stop and covered complaint paved the way for his arrogance. His phone buzzed, a message from his union lawyer. "Union will cover your legal defense, but the department won't. You're on your own." He stared at the message until the words blurred. Everything he counted on, the silence of his peers, the shield of the badge, was gone. For the first time, he understood. Angela Hargrave wasn't just his enemy. She was his reckoning. Angela's closing move. As midnight neared, Angela sat at her desk, pen in hand, signing the final draft of the civil rights lawsuit. The names lined up in perfect symmetry. Ryan Callum, Captain Howard Brenner, Greenhaven Police Department, and the City of Greenhaven. She slid the document into an envelope, sealing it with a press of her fingers. Tomorrow morning, it would be filed in federal court. And by the time the sun rose, the entire system would be on trial. The trial of a system. The courtroom was packed. It was the largest chamber in the Greenhaven District Courthouse, but it still wasn't enough to hold everyone who wanted to witness what had already been dubbed the trial of the badge. The gallery was overflowing with journalists, activists, community leaders, and regular citizens, many of whom had their own stories of wrongful stops and police harassment, stories that had never made it past a whispered complaint. Angela Hargrave stood at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her legal team. Her posture was straight, her face calm, but there was a quiet fury burning in her chest, the kind of fire that comes from years of seeing the system protect its own at all costs. But not today. At the defense table sat Ryan Callum, shoulders hunched, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. The officer who had once strutted through the precinct, cracking jokes about mouthy suspects, now looked like a man waiting for his own sentencing. Next to Callum sat Captain Howard Brenner, his face pale but stoic. On his right was City Attorney William Greaves, who had the thankless job of defending not just Callum, but the entire Greenhaven Police Department and the city itself, all named in Angela's civil rights suit. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The judge entered, Judge Margaret Lynn, a no-nonsense federal judge known for her intolerance of procedural games and courtroom theatrics. Her reputation preceded her, and everyone in the room understood that today was about facts, not spin. All rise. The case was officially underway. Opening salvos, Angela's lead counsel, Monique Sellers, approached the podium with the quiet confidence of a woman who had more evidence than the defense could ever hope to explain away. This case, Monique began, is not just about one officer who made a mistake. It's about a system that taught him that mistake would have no consequences. She let the word settle. Officer Callum didn't act alone, even if no one else was there when he unlawfully detained Ms. Hargrave. He was acting with the confidence that comes from knowing his fellow officers, his supervisors, even the city itself would cover for him, because that's how Greenhaven PD has operated for years. The defense lawyer, Mitch Cantor, rose with none of Monique's poise. His job was near impossible, spinning clear video evidence, documented misconduct, and a national spotlight into something that could pass for a misunderstanding. Officer Callum responded to a situation based on the information available to him at the time. Cantor said, "He made a judgment call in the interest of public safety." Angela watched with clinical detachment. She had heard it all before. The fear defense, the quick decision under pressure, the plea for understanding the stress of the job. But this time, it wasn't going to work, because she was the evidence. The takedown begins. Monique called Angela to the stand first. Angela was ready. Her testimony was a surgical dismantling of Callum's conduct. From the very first step he took out of his cruiser to the moment he shoved her into the backseat. Every sentence was precise, every legal citation seamless. "He did not have reasonable suspicion," Angela said, her voice clear, her gaze unwavering. "He did not ask for my identification until after I questioned his authority to stop me. He did not check my credentials when presented with them." She paused just long enough to let the jury absorb the gravity of her words. "He treated me like a threat because I was walking while black in a neighborhood he considered out of place for someone who looked like me." Monique held up a still frame from Callum's body camera footage. Callum smirking, one hand on his belt, the other holding the cuffs before Angela had even spoken. "This is what profiling looks like," Angela said. Callum's reckoning. When it was Callum's turn to testify, his hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone. "Officer Callum," Monique began, "how long have you served with Greenhaven PD?" 7 years, he answered, his voice hoarse. "In those 7 years, how many formal complaints were filed against you?" Callum's lawyer objected, but Judge Lynn waved it off. "Overruled." "Answer the question." Callum swallowed. 8. 8 complaints, Monique repeated, all of which were either dismissed or resolved with internal counseling. "Yes," Callum muttered. "Let's talk about those complaints." Monique picked up a folder and held up the first complaint form. 2019. Excessive force complaint filed by a black teenager stopped for matching the description. "Do you remember that?" Callum's lawyer objected again, but Judge Lynn allowed it. Callum shifted in his seat. I don't remember all the details." Monique placed the teen's hospital report on the evidence screen. Photos of bruised wrists, a split lip. "Do you remember this young man's face, officer?" Callum's silence was answer enough. Systemic rot on display. The next witness was Sergeant Janice Powers, the same officer who had called Callum out the morning after Angela's arrest. Powers had decided to break the code of silence. She'd had enough. For years, Powers said, we all knew Callum had a tendency to escalate stops. We knew he had a particular attitude toward minority suspects. It was talked about, in whispers. "Did anyone formally report this?" Monique asked. Powers hesitated. There were unofficial conversations with command staff. And what was the response? Powers' lips pressed into a thin line. "We were told Callum was a good cop who got results, that he just needed time to mature." Angela kept her expression calm, but inside, fury burned. How does a culture like that survive? Monique asked. Power's answer was blunt. Because no one wants to be the first one to cross the blue line. The turning point. The prosecution's final blow came in the form of the DOJ's preliminary investigation report, which Angela's team had successfully subpoenaed. It was a scathing indictment, not just of Callum, but of Greenhaven PD's internal affairs process, its record-keeping, and its culture of protecting repeat offenders. The report concluded, Greenhaven Police Department has engaged in a sustained pattern of unconstitutional stops and racial profiling disproportionately targeting black and brown residents. Internal investigations lacked transparency, and officers with repeated complaints were protected rather than disciplined. It was a death sentence for the department's credibility. Verdict and fallout. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Ryan Callum liable on all counts: wrongful detention, violation of civil rights, unlawful search and seizure, and excessive force. But the verdict didn't stop there. They also found Greenhaven PD and the city of Greenhaven liable for fostering a culture that encouraged and protected unconstitutional policing. The judgment awarded Angela both compensatory and punitive damages, but more importantly, it ordered federal oversight of Greenhaven PD, including a court-appointed monitor to oversee reforms. Angela didn't smile when the verdict was read. Justice wasn't about joy. It was about accountability. Aftermath. Callum was fired within 48 hours, stripped of his badge, and referred for criminal investigation. Captain Brenner retired, trying to outrun disgrace. Several senior officers either resigned or were pushed out, and Greenhaven PD became the first department in the state's history placed under full federal oversight. Angela stood on the courthouse steps that evening, looking over the sea of reporters. "This isn't a victory," she said. "It's a beginning. Real justice isn't about one case. It's about dismantling the systems that allow injustice to thrive." She walked down the steps, her head high, her heels clicking. Angela Hargrave had fought the system, and this time, the system lost.